All right, so we are beginning our next topic, which we'll cover the next 2 weeks, scientists, practitioners. That's a broad topic. Basically, I wanted to give you a little bit more in-depth look at how psychology is applied to work. I know we've talked about this before, but this will go a little bit further. And for this first topic, just kind of talking about what we mean by scientist practitioners, or another term, the scientist practitioner model. That's something that most IO psychologists are trained in. I know I certainly was. So there's two pieces to that. The science piece, which y'all are familiar with at this point in your education, generating, sharing knowledge, how that's done. And then the practice piece, so how that's applied. Um, Psychology applied to work, right? That's the name of this class. So this field generally is very much applied, which is why we get trained in this perspective. And so to start speaking to the knowledge piece, um, we haven't covered this in this class. Usually when I talk about research methods, I like to kind of mention these two types of reasoning, or the way some people classify it as inductive and deductive. In science, we often talk about theory a lot, right? Some sort of theory or explanation for why things happen, how they happen, so on and so forth. Some sort of explanation that is very broad and applicable in a lot of contexts. And the typical scientific way of doing that via the scientific method is taking some sort of theory, using that as a foundation to make predictions, what we call hypotheses, and then test those predictions like in experiments. What doesn't get nearly as much credit most of the time in science is inductive reasoning. If you think like times before the scientific method, um, how knowledge was generated, a lot of it through observations, right? And this still happens today. Generally observing things, noticing those patterns, and then developing some sort of theory from those patterns. Um, so yeah, like I said, wanted to kind of mention the difference here. Um, the deductive piece relies, or oftentimes we're emphasizing a lot more like rational thinking, logic, inductive reasoning, relies a lot more on intuition, but both certainly are valid, or I would argue both are valid when it comes to science and knowledge. This slide, same thing, just with more technical terms, if you'd like to look at it. And so, to give some examples of the practice piece, or like, say you wanted to go into IO psychology, I know some students have expressed that in this class, and you wanted to go out and work in industry. Um, there's a lot of different job titles you could have. We covered some of these in week 2. I think that was the third slides for the course. But to give a little bit more context on what that type of work usually looks like, oftentimes these are grouped into internal and external positions. And to explain that, these are old examples, I think from 2019, 2020, when I first was teaching an IO course at another institution. But still, hopefully, provide a good example of what we mean by this. And so to start with the internal piece, if you're an internal IO psychologist, internal whatever it may be, someone with this sort of background, going out and working in an organization, that basically means you work within the organization, or you're an internal practitioner. Um, so say, for example, you wanted to work for a really big organization and work within their own institutional research or something like that. So some examples I pulled from the past. So if I don't think there's any Sprouts in Alaska. Sprouts is a chain of grocery stores. Sprouts Farmers Markets, they call them. And so this title here, Manager of Organizational Development, that's one example of an internal applied practitioner IO psychology type of job. Another example, this was at FedEx, Vice President of Human Resources. Many people with this background can certainly go into HR. It's not the only path that you'd have to go into. One more example, ACT, like the standardized test ACT, Senior Research Scientist. Um, that connection might not be as obvious. I'd say it's within IO, but really there's a subfield that spans IO and other fields in and outside of psychology, psychometrics, basically how we measure things. And so on some sort of standardized test like that, they're trying to measure very precisely cognitive ability. I don't know what else you would want to call it, like education level, something like that. Something to kind of predict how you might do in college. And so some people with this background go and work for standardized testing companies. And it seems like that's becoming less relevant as things like the GRE are going away or becoming less required by colleges. But another example there, external. Generally the same concept, except you're working outside of the company with which you are doing the work, or the company whose needs you are helping meet. So often you work for a firm that specializes in this type of work, what we might call a consulting firm. And so, for example, if there's some big organization that is looking for help with something, they might hire out a contract with a firm of consultants, and so there'd be some external consultant working within there. External meaning they're external to the organizations they're working with. They work for the firm, but they contract out, consult with organizations. And so then the firm comes in, um, or some of the firm via the external consultants come in and help them out with their issues, problems, whatever it is they might be facing. So some examples there. A lot of times these job titles have consultant in the name. So here, a senior consultant for assessment solutions, PSI services. I forget the specifics of that company, but there's a lot of consulting firms in IO that specialize in various things. This one, assessment, so any sort of assessment measurement in the workplace. Senior consultant for OE strategies. Another one I don't know too much about. I assume, I don't know, some sort of strategic organizational change, organizational development, whatever it may be. Um, so some examples there. And so I guess to give a little bit more context, say some organization is struggling with turnover. They're having a lot of turnover in a particular part of the company, a particular job, something like that. They might already have people internal that can do that. Usually they have to be pretty big in order to do that. Um, and so if they're not as big, or for, I don't know, for any sort of other reason, there could be lots of factors there, be it legal, ethical, organizational, whatever it may be. They might hire an external firm to come in and help them with that turnover problem. So in past iterations of this course, I've had students go a lot more in depth into applied projects and developing an applied project proposal. I didn't do that this time around because I wanted to try out some different things. But I know some students expressed some interest in getting that experience. So we'll have some applied assignments throughout the course, one of which will start this week. So if you wanted a reference for what this looks like, this textbook here, Real World Research, is one that is really is really dense, but I would recommend. I know it's something that when I was taking a graduate school class, for example, that was the textbook we relied on. That goes through these 10 steps. I'm not going to go in depth on all those, but this is a broad overview if you wanted to start here and kind of look deeper. For a simpler version, um, basically identifying a need with a client. So again, this could be internal if you're working for your organization and there's already a need there. Or if it's external, they might come to you with some sort of need they have, some sort of issue they'd like to address, like a turnover problem, for example. Then you might plan the project. If there's some sort of turnover intervention, maybe it's lack of training, maybe it's some sort of occupational health issue, maybe it's some sort of leadership issue, maybe it's some sort of more job related issue like the tasks on the job, and the burden that they might place on the workers, whatever it may be. Plan some sort of projects, some sort of intervention to either understand it more, intervene on it, try to fix the problem. It really depends on the context of the need that was initially identified by the organization. Then you do the project. Um, yeah, so you do it like, I don't know, I forget what I had searched in Google originally to find this, probably some sort of training or something like that. Um, but say like, I don't know, there was a turnover problem and it related to lack of training. People weren't getting trained adequately for the job, and so they were leaving because they felt unprepared and overburdened. Lateral overload. There's lots of factors that might be at play there. So you go in, do this training intervention, and then you follow up with the organization. Basically, if there was a training intervention, there's steps you can do before, during, and after training to assess that and try to identify what's working, what could be improved, and overall how the intervention did, if that actually addressed the overall turnover problem. And so there'd be that follow-up piece. So that's a very simple example there. One other thing I wanted to mention with the scientist practitioner model is to kind of create a Venn diagram here. Ideally, these overlap and inform one another, right? In the ideal world, what's happening in science, what's happening in research is informing what's happening in practice, what's happening in the quote unquote real world. And then Furthermore, what's happening in the real world will inform what's being researched. But oftentimes there's something people call a science practice gap. I think I would imagine this extends to other fields too. I can only speak to IO psychology, but this is certainly something we talk about. If you'd like a definition, there's one here. This disconnect between the knowledge that academics are producing and the knowledge that practitioners are consuming. So I think the key term there is disconnect, right? There's a gap, there's a disconnect. Um, there's some sort of misalignment um, or something missing in general between these two spheres. Yeah, and another way to put it, there's a gap between theory and the real world, something that's talked about a lot in academia in general. I don't know, you might have heard the term ivory tower. In some ways, to me, that's reflecting. I guess reflecting a lot of things, but one piece of that is this gap between academia and the rest of society. And sometimes this gap, there's a lot to this, so I don't want to sit here and I hope I don't convey that this is like the full picture, but to give you at least a piece of the picture of why this is the case, I kind of put some thoughts and information together here. So sometimes there's issues in how generalizable research is. Generalizability is something you might have learned about in other classes, or maybe in methods you've learned about external validity. Those are kind of touching on the same thing. Basically, it's referring to how much knowledge from research applies or generalizes to other settings. One example there from this field, this was a focal article in 2016 called "Where Have All the Workers Gone?" And basically, it was focused on sampling issues within the field. So basically, the samples used in research and how those actually generalize to workers in society. And so there's a lot on this table. Basically, what people did in this article was they looked at the top 5 journals, so the most highly cited, most prestigious journals, and looked at the samples that were used in studies of those journals over these 2, 3 years, 2012 to 2014. And so you can see here, students is a huge chunk of participants in research studies. This is true throughout psychology. I know it's criticism of the field in general, and that we're doing research oftentimes with college students traditionally. That's like 18 to 22-year-olds, somewhere around that range, some of which maybe have never worked a full-time job. And so if we're trying to do research on what it's like to be out there working in jobs, be they part-time or full-time or contract, volunteer, whatever they may be, that's obviously a clear disconnect. Um, I forget exactly how they quantify non-workers. I don't want to go on too much of a tangent. There's this one thing called MTurk, Mechanical Turk. Um, I don't know if that's something y'all would be familiar with or not. If you're not familiar with it, I think it's owned by Amazon, and basically it's a way to kind of farm out or crowdsource information. And so one way that happens is people can go in and there's a bunch of people that are, I think they're called Turkers, M-Turkers. I forget the term exactly, but basically people who will get paid to do some sort of task. In this case, it might be a way to get a really quick sample of people for some sort of study. Like I've heard stories from colleagues who have done a study with MTurk and they get a sample of 500 people overnight, whereas in other contexts that can take months to years. Um, so that's one example of what a non-worker might be, someone who's not directly working in that industry or context. And I guess the underlying point here is that you can see workers, just generally workers, were the least sampled population in studies about psychology of light work. So that's a problem, right? That's one clear example of a lack of external validity or lack of generalizability. Um, Sometimes this gap is related to inequities in access to knowledge and production of knowledge. So I don't know, like if uh, if someone doesn't have a academic email address, doesn't have or doesn't work for an institution that has subscriptions to all these journals, then oftentimes there's a paywall, right? You have to pay money to access a journal, or you have to access it through other means that go outside of the sort of industry structure that's been created. Um, and so one key issue there that I don't know I'm passionate about, and so I'll try to restrain myself from going too far down this rabbit hole. But scientific publishing is often for profit. If you'd like to read more, there's a media article link here and a research article link that kind of dive into that. Um, so basically, it raises the question of who can access knowledge and who benefits from that knowledge, both in terms of what the knowledge is about, then also to if it's for profit, who is ultimately profiting off this knowledge. Um, and so one could argue that this is exploitation of labor. To, to explain that first, um, using this simple, or my attempt to be simple here, basically, researchers do work, they're doing some sort of research. Other researchers peer review that work, so you submit it to some journal and then it's put out for peer review. And then, assuming that it is accepted to the journal will publish that article, then the journal profits off that. And so the people who haven't profited are the participants in that study, the researchers who did that study, the researchers who peer reviewed it, and oftentimes the people editing the journal to begin with. And so there's a clear inequity there in terms of who is profiting off of that. Um, there's a whole argument we can or we will go into somewhat here and then somewhat next week, I think, about the people being served, so like the participants, the communities involved, so on and so forth. But just kind of one example of that here. And something to think about here too is competing values. If you think about, I guess I don't want to insert myself too much, but thinking about the competing values framework that we talked about, when we talked about organizational culture, there might be some misalignment there in the values that um, are inherent within science and those that are inherent within practice. Like for example, one of those values is market, right? Basically, it's we're competing in the market to try to do things fast. Oftentimes, in the applied industry business world, that is what is prioritized, right? Doing things quickly. And in science, that's often one thing that's valued, but there's also this strong value on doing things right, right? Trying to study things as precisely and accurately as possible. And so, just one way to think about the fact that these values might often be competing or misaligned. Um, and yeah, I'm sure there's other ways to look at that too, but that's just kind of an initial thought there. Also, there can be gaps within each. So in science, what knowledge is valued and considered valid? Something we've talked about, I think we've talked about here. I talk about in a lot of my classes. We'll kind of go into that here in a sec more. Inequities in research. So, like mentioned on the last slide, there certainly can be inequities between institutions and researchers and the people or communities being impacted by that research. Um, Hierarchies in research teams. So, for example, in psychology, author order matters, meaning that if you are a first author, if you are a second author, if you are a third author, so on and so forth, those carry different weights or different levels of prestige or value. Um, in other words, yeah, actually, I'll kind of leave it at that. Basically, that matters, right? What order you're listed in as authors has some indication about how much you contributed to the project. Whereas in other fields, that doesn't matter at all. They might just list authors alphabetically. And so this can vary discipline to discipline, but something to mention. There can also be barriers to diverse perspectives in science. And just one obvious example, most science is published in the English language. So in order to contribute to and consume scientific literature, typically you have to be proficient in the English language. Um, yeah, another example of hierarchies, there's hierarchies of prestige in every aspect of science in terms of institutions, right? Like institutions are ranked in all sorts of ways. Um, there can be prestige in journals, right? So which journals have the highest impact factor, which if you the math behind that is basically how many times they're getting cited on average, or how many times each article is getting cited on average. Um, and hierarchies in researchers, right? Within a research team, the people ultimately driving, the people that are contributing but are um, more following orders might have less power in decision making, um, so on and so forth. And then cultural norms of academia, kind of going back to the competing values idea. Um, Yeah, and really anywhere research is done. Oftentimes there can be a misalignment between the overall cultural norms within this context and cultural norms of people um, from cultures outside of that context. Or another way to think of it is Western and anything but Western, because academia, my experience is very rooted in this Western culture. And to kind of go back to this first point, when knowledge is valued, considered valid. Um, One thing I like to mention, the idea of integration, and that um, there are kind of two knowledge streams depicted here in this image. The Western knowledge stream, which is more that science, scientific literature, research publications, stuff like that, and the native knowledge stream. Um, and historically, traditionally, the Western knowledge stream um, is more privileged, more valued by broader society, by research institutions, academic institutions, things like that. Um, so one way um, that I know this is true in psychology, and I hope in other fields, um, one way to try to mitigate that or level the playing field with those inequities is systemic integration, recognizing that these two different knowledge streams are absolutely valuable, um, and so therefore integration is a way to um, integrate both. My gosh, there's got to be another word there. And then within practice, same concepts generally apply. Um, and people could argue back and forth all sorts of ways about this, but like what knowledge is known and shared publicly. So within organizations and outside of organizations, some institutions, some people in industry publish what's called white papers, which is basically like a research article um, published in industry. So they look different, but it's the same concept as trying to share knowledge about what's been done and what they found. Um, but not everything is shared. Information can be proprietary, and so that's why like we could have tons of arguments and debates about um, if, what, and how should be shared publicly from industry. The ability time to interpret knowledge, typically in applied context, most people aren't that interested or don't have time or don't have the background to really dive deep into the theory, the statistics, the math, the whatever it may be, the methods that were used to generate some sort of knowledge. A lot of times people just want simple interpretations, simple actionable things that they can do. Um, Basically, like the quick, simple stuff, because that is usually what is most relevant or most valued. And so, another example of how that gap can present itself. And very related to that, the sense of urgency. Um, I don't know. I know, like, in just thinking about myself, my IO psychology graduate school training, we spent a lot of time learning the right way to do it. Um, but then in the applied world, oftentimes there's a need to move much faster and there's a need to focus more on what's good rather than perfect. And so those values can often be competing. Um, and that sense of urgency can be due to a lot of different things, whether it's organizational constraints, societal constraints, broader economic happenings, whatever it may be. Just some other thoughts from my experiences doing applied work. Certainly inequities in whose perspectives are valued. Like, for example, in hierarchical structures, there can be really different perspectives. Like, if you went and talked to, I'm just thinking of one, I'm avoiding naming specifics because I signed an NDA. But, like, in one project, there was an emphasis on building a safety culture, and there was a really big difference in how the culture around safety was viewed in general between the executives and the people actually doing the work for the organization, like working in um, I guess the facility, the processing facility, um, and so that can vary a lot. Inequities in how information is shared within organizations. So what, when, with whom, yeah, on and on. Another way that those perspectives can differ, or another, I'd say, influential factor in how those perspectives can differ. Um, Something I wanted to mention, I think it'll come up at another point in this course, but um, one term we've talked about or one term that's talked about a lot in psychology is organizational justice. Um, so there are different ways we can think about justice in organizations or like overall fairness. And this is one way people have conceptualized that distributive, procedural, interpersonal, and informational justice. Um, I won't go too deep into that, but I wanted to mention it here and provide this for you. And then if you'd like to discuss it further, maybe next week when we're having in-class discussions, we could absolutely dive deeper into that. But it's certainly something that is important to mention and can differ greatly when it comes to things like this. And I'll say, like, there have been efforts to reduce the science practice gap. There's a lot here, so I wanted to provide it for you if you want to go more in depth. This is within the context of IO psychology. I trimmed the journal. I forget what journal this was from exactly, but there's a link to the article if you'd like to go look at it. And so these tables on this slide and the next two slides summarize these overall recommendations, like just focusing on one example here. Require pre-registration of quantitative and qualitative primary studies. Basically, like, there's often an issue in research in that what is published is what was interesting or what had some sort of significant findings. When people do research and they don't find significant results, that is often not published, and therefore what we see are only the significant findings, and we're completely missing all the things that weren't significant. And that can be problematic if we're building all these theories and ideas off of only what we found that was significant and we ignored everything else. And so one way to try to skirt around that issue is to require pre-registration. So basically, like, you would submit a proposal for a theory, or I'm sorry, proposal for some sort of study, and then if the journal accepted that, they would publish the results no matter what the findings were. And so that's one way to try to alleviate that. But again, there's a lot more here um, that I don't know. I'd encourage you to spend a little bit more time on. But one last question to pose that we'll kind of touch on more next week is, who are these efforts helping? And is anyone being missed? And I guess to spoil that, um, I would say that a lot of these recommendations are focused on the science piece and much less the practice piece, right? And so there's deeper questions we can ask there about who these efforts are helping. I'm not saying they're a bad thing. I would endorse many of these efforts. I'd have to look more closely to provide, I guess, a coherent, full opinion. But um, despite the fact that these are good efforts, we also might not be fully addressing the gap because we're focused on one piece of that gap. So something to think about. Anyway, that's been enough. We'll see you next one. Next one? Next time. Whatever.